Welcome to Are the Expert. This is the 7th series, and we're joined today with Ryan Ramsey from Project 7 Consulting. So welcome, Ryan.
Thank you.
I'm just going to check people's microphones. Right, perfect. Okay, so Ryan, it would be great just to kind of get a little bit of an understanding as to who you are and kind of a little bit of your kind of background and what it is that you do today to kind of really help people in your specialism. So we've kind of headed it as submarine leadership, so it would be really great to understand more about that.
So I was, excuse me, I was in the military for 26 years, most of that within the submarine service. For me, the privilege was being in command of HMS Turbulent for 3 years and 4 months. A fantastic experience. I then went on to teach submarine captains for 2 years before leaving the submarine service. Why did I leave the submarine service in the Royal Navy? I wanted to try something different. And so I went into business. So the first job that I had was in charge of an oil rig in the North Sea. And I led at $117 a barrel and $27 a barrel, which was really, really a challenge. But the whole bit for me was about how do you maintain productivity? How do you keep morale up? How do you keep everything going effectively during times of crisis and change? And I learned loads from that. But I realized that I needed to learn more. So I then went off to National Grid and I was head of construction for 2 years. I've never done any construction, so I had to learn all about that and lead a team of 250 National Grid employees and about 4,000 contractors delivering projects across the UK, ranging from the London power tunnels down to substation changes or substation builds. And then I'd learned quite a bit about corporate background and corporate entities and how they operate at a strategic level. And the one piece that was missing for me was entrepreneurial leadership. I did not understand what that term actually meant. So I got the opportunity to work for a small company called CityFibre, who are now quite a big company, and go through a series of experiences of learning to work with entrepreneurs and small companies, growing company, mergers and acquisitions, everything else that went with it. And at that time, which was the beginning of last year, I needed to rest, take a sabbatical, put it all together with what I'd learned, and then worked out where I wanted to go next, which was into consulting. And the reason that I do what I do now is because it's just great to go into companies, help them out, help them on the journey of achieving success and achieving cultural change. So that's what I do.
Perfect. Okay, so because obviously leadership these days, it will be interesting to see how people adapt because of the situation we've been in the last few months now, and kind of you're seeing that obviously we're easing out of lockdown and people are starting to kind of, go back to whatever this new norm will be, but that leadership edge is going to be different. Now, obviously working on the submarines, you were isolated for huge periods of time. Is there sort of some key things that you could share just to the group around kind of what that looked like and how different that would be from, not being on the submarine?
So I think I spend a lot of time reflecting about all of my leadership experiences, and I'm really grateful for the time that I had in a submarine because it's a steel tube, it's contained, the effective leadership and the effective teamwork is absolutely visible all the time. They talk about a thing called the shadow of the leader, and it's absolutely evident in different submarines who the leader is and how they lead, and that's not always good. It can be poor as well. So not everybody's a good leader. So what I did do, I've looked at loads of leadership models, and during this period of lockdown, I got asked to speak on the BBC at the very beginning of it about dealing with isolation, and then gradually I started looking at leadership models and the relation between going to sea on a submarine and then coming back and reintegrating into society. And amazingly, all the things that you go through as a submariner or a military guy in general translate. So if I talk in 3 different things, the first one is about living in isolation. So we've lived in isolation effectively for 3 and a bit months, which is quite a long patrol effectively. And during that period of time, the really important things were about establishing routines. So that's starting and stopping, taking breaks when you can, and early on in the process was making sure that people cleaned the place that they were living in. It was about taking exercise, both physical and mentally, and communicating regularly. So those things became really important to focus on.
Oh, let me just mute somebody. There you go. Sorry about that.
But then quickly you ended up looking at leadership. And for me, when you look across all the models, there was only three things that you need for leadership, and it translates everywhere. So if you imagine that it's about people, it's about process, which enables performance, then there's only three things. The first one's about leading by example, and that's about being consistent in the way that you do things, having compassion for the crisis that we've been in, being calm during this crisis, and being committed to the cause and the team. And then it's about the team first, so it's about empowerment. How do you empower them to achieve success? And loads of companies have struggled with this, with the working remotely, where they've been used to having their people close to hand and being able to deal with them. It's about knowing your people, fostering permission to fail. So some of the work I've been doing with some of the FTSE 100 companies, their senior leadership are really concerned about how decisions that they've made during this crisis are going to be viewed afterwards. And it's about turning around and saying, look, people will make wrong decisions and will fail, but as long as you recover from it and you record what you did, then you're in a good position. And then the third element is direction and guidance, and the leader should be just turning around and saying what and why, and the team should be able to come up with the how, because they're empowered to do that. So I think that's the leadership element. And then probably the final piece is the submarine emotional journey. And basically you sail, there's a period of adjustment. This is the cycle. You get into a routine, and submarine operations are generally 70% boredom and 30% pure adrenaline rush. You go into an adrenaline rush, then you're back into routine, then you're getting ready for arrival and readjustment. And what I hadn't considered until this process was the emotional journey that goes with that. So on sailing, there's sadness because you're leaving your family, you're leaving what's going on. You go into a period of acceptance, which is relatively quick. And then there's a period of guilt as you settle into that, because you're no longer thinking about your family, you're actually thinking about your crew and everything else that goes with it. You get calmness, you get boredom, you get excitement. And then as you're coming back home, you've got that excitement that you are returning back home and you're going to meet your family again and resettle in. And then you go into contentment, and that cycle just continues as is. So as we're coming out of lockdown, we're very much reaching probably the excitement and intrepidation part of transitioning to a new normality.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally relate to kind of all of that, and some really, really key sort of themes and words that are coming out there. So fantastic. Thank you, Ryan. So over to you guys in the room, if you have any questions. Paul, would you like to unmute? And then John after.
Hi, Ryan. My question is around decision making. Okay, so with COVID, we're having to make decisions quite quickly, and quicker than we've ever had done before. And I was reading an article in The Guardian about something you said about an incident in the Indian Ocean where your air conditioning packed up in your submarine, and it was 60 degrees. And one of our cars today is air conditioning's packed up, and we can open the window, but clearly you can't do that. So my question is, the course of action you took there, how did you decide what to do, and how quickly did you do it?
That's a really good question. So I think there's two elements to, and for the story, effectively,
Hang on, let me just...
we sailed into the Indian Ocean, and as we were on the surface, all the air conditioning plants packed up 2.5 hours out of Fujairah. And at that point, the temperature soared within the submarine really, really quickly. So in the forward part of the submarine, the temperature went up to 45 degrees Celsius and about 80% humidity. And then back aft in the engine room, it was up at 60 degrees Celsius and 100% humidity. And very quickly, we started suffering significant casualties. So in a 2.5 hour period, we were close to I'd describe it as losing the submarine effectively. There's fail safes on the reactor, so the reactor will shut itself down. The weapons can cook off at a certain temperature, which is really bad. But my main priority was my people, and I was genuinely scared and concerned about what was happening with them. When you reach a figure of 27 casualties and you've lost a significant part of your leadership at that point as well, it becomes draining. The other piece with that is that the entire command structure, effectively, or the organisational structure, had fallen apart because key people had fallen out of it. And by empowerment, people were jumping up into those positions and filling them without me asking. People were going off and doing stuff autonomously without me having to say, you need to go and do this. So, for example, whilst I was trying to work out in my head how we deal with, I'm not an engineer, so I can't talk about fixing the problem, but what we do and what course of action we take. But I hadn't even considered that the air purification plants weren't running because they'd shut down everything to minimize heat. But the fact is, if the air purification plants aren't running, then you're going to build up with carbon dioxide and you kill everybody anyway. But the guy went off and set off the emergency ones and everything else, so you got those things going. When it comes to decision making, at the time, I was making decisions, and I think for the situation that we were in, I'd made all the appropriate decisions that I possibly could with the information I had at that time. In reflection, and this was the piece that, for example, some of the bankers are really worried about, is the decisions that I made were analysed back in the United Kingdom, as you'd expect, with a board of inquiry and everything else that goes with it. And the answer was, you should never have sailed. And that was quite interesting for me because, it hit me quite personally at that time. And I'm used to my decisions being analysed all the time. But if it never sailed, nothing would have ever happened, and I wouldn't have put 27 people through that experience, or in fact an entire team through that experience. And when they sequenced it, they said this was the point. And I said, but that was not the information that I had presented to me at that time. With the information I had presented to me at that time, this was the decision I made, and this was the flow that went with it. So the recovery was never questioned. What I did, diving the submarine, which was a bit counterintuitive to what everybody else would have done, was the right thing to do. The reality was, I don't think there was any other option except to do that. The nearest help was 24 hours away, which was in Bahrain, nearest ship. The nearest helicopter was in Oman, but you could get me 2 or 3 helicopters. They could be on station for an hour maybe, but they could only lift off so many people, so I was never going to get everybody off. I couldn't abandon the submarine. I didn't want to abandon the submarine. That would be a absolute political disaster. I couldn't go back to Fujairah because people would die before we got there. And therefore, for me, that drove me down the decision-making piece. The only option is to dive the submarine with all the tertiary systems, cool the submarine down, change the internal water, change the water in the ballast tanks. I knew it was cooler down at 200 meters than it was on the surface. And it worked, which was great news. However, there was a moment when I remember when we were just about, I explained it, and I was communicating all the time to the team and saying, this is what we're going to do and how we're going to do it. So they all knew it. But there was this point, and I remember this point distinctly, was my team, did they believe in the decision that I just made? And I felt at one point, I thought, actually, they don't have faith in what I'm about to do. And therefore, I have to prove. So the best bit was, we dived the submarine, everybody's wondering whether it's going to work, and what I said would happen happened, which was the temperature started to drop. And as soon as I said the water temperature will drop, this will give us time, this will enable us to do this, this and this, they saw the first step of that journey, and therefore the decision was seen correct. Did that answer your question?
That's fantastic. And some real lessons there in terms of, just analysing all the facts, making a decision, and communicating it to your team. It's similar to me today. I mean, obviously the car breaks, I booked into the garage, so similar situation to you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Paul, for the question. John.
Yep. Thank you very much for your description there, Ryan. But I have no experience of military leadership, except that I flew aeroplanes privately for a while, and there's a lot of parallels, I think, in aviation, where you only have a certain amount of information at certain times. And I was lucky enough to operate in a flying private club that was led by an ex-Royal Air Force squadron leader who was wonderful, old school guy, who said wonderful things like, discipline is only to be imposed when suggestion and persuasion have failed, and these kind of things. He was great. But anyway, what I wanted to ask you about was, you described the emotional, or the sequence that people go through on a submarine voyage. And presumably most of the time you're fairly well aware of the duration of the voyage in advance, and therefore you can see what you're coming up. The difference with the isolation that we're in is we might not know how long this is, and what effect do you think that has?
Yes, so that's a really good question. And so sometimes you will know, the duration of the patrol, and sometimes that will change. And so what I said at the very beginning of this was, people were saying, when do you think we're going to get out of this? And I said, I've told my team August. They went, that's a long way out. And I said, no, but it's expectation management. So I told them to plan that we will not exit until August. Prepare yourself. We're staying there until anything before that is better. And the second part of that is that we may enter a second lockdown. And so, what are we going to learn as a team now that is going to make it easier to transition back into this status that we're in now? So with a submarine patrol, you might be told that you're going off for a 60-day patrol, and then you get a message that turns around and gives you a heads up, which is nice. Turns around and says your patrol might be extended, and some of those patrols can extend out to 110 days, which is long old haul. Now, if you imagine, when you've got food for 90 days on board, you have to start rationing the food. So you go on to a thing called fleet portions, which is just horrible. You got to manage people's expectations. So teams, they've been in this steel tube working 6 hours on, 6 hours off continuously for maybe 60 days at that point. Now they're not going to get back and see their families, or now they're not going to get to go on a run ashore to somewhere. So managing that transition is really, really important, because I don't think you can just turn around and say, we're just doing this, get on and deal with it. You have to help them through that process. And so for me, the way we've managed COVID, I think, if there's any politicians here, I apologise, but I don't think the political leadership have got it right completely. It's not, and they've got a very difficult job without a doubt. The communications piece has not been clever. Translate that down to businesses, they're trying their hardest. There's a complete mismatch with who's doing what, where, when, and I think if we'd have turned around and set that date a lot further out, that would have allowed the expectation management to have kicked in and people to just settle down into this is life as we know it. I mean, 30 days forms a habit, doesn't it? So actually the real, I'll tell you what the real transition now is transitioning back out of this. And if I think there's three groups of people. The first one are those that want to get back to normality. They're missing social interaction. They've not enjoyed the process of being at home. They probably don't believe the risk of COVID-19 is as bad as it actually is. The next group is about fear. So there's a fear that there's a real risk to them, and they're really worried about how they're being told they've got to go back to work, but they don't understand the interaction as to whether they're going to get it, give it, pass it on, and they believe it's being forced upon them. And then there's a third group, and they're interesting because it's all about those that have been furloughed, and there's a few groups in there. So there's one group that are going to have to reintegrate the teams that are already up and working, and they've got to go back into that. There's a second group that's struggling with their own self-worth. So people have been pulled, other people have been pulled out of furlough and back to work, but they're not. So they're wondering whether they've got a job at the end of this, because if they're not asking for me to come back, what am I actually doing here? And then the third group who really enjoyed being paid with no work, and they don't want to go back to work. And I think that, what we say to organisations at the moment is you need to have a plan in place to be able to deal with that. So it's describing the potential behaviours between those groups of people, communicating the physical and mental safety plan, and then it's for leaders to do what they say they're going to be doing and to be seen to be doing it. And it won't go right first time. So there's the lessons learned, continuous improvement process, and then continuing that cycle. So I think if people are focused like that about how they put in as much time and effort planning how they're going to get out of this, but do it at an emotional level. I mean, everybody is exhausted. I would say everybody's exhausted. Everybody's angst. You only have to see that with riots going on, social disorder, everything else. Everybody's uncertain. No people within the United Kingdom, I find few have got belief in what we're actually doing. They can't understand the data because the data is not available. It's just very chaotic. And so if you, for a small group of people, are able to provide that certainty, that's got to help them out.
No, I totally agree with that. And I think, we are all different anyway without this situation. Our personalities dictate different behaviours and attitudes. So with this on top, which none of us were prepared for, had ever even thought or imagined that we would be in this situation. So everyone is dealing with it the best way that they feel, but very much so that leadership capacity around that whole theme of emotional intelligence, I think is going to be really, really important. You know, being empathetic but not being patronising. You know, that's quite a key thing. So Nicholas, you have a question.
I have. Thank you for that. It kind of follows on. Can you all hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Ryan. It kind of, and Lorraine, it kind of follows on from this irrational behaviour thing, and it's so I've read Ian Ballantyne's book, The Deadly Trade, which I found absolutely fascinating. I'm sure you've read it as well.
Okay.
And there's, sorry,
You got to mention in that.
you did.
Yeah.
I can't remember your mention specifically, but maybe I'm now about to reveal a part that you were involved in, because I can't remember the names of the people involved. However, Ian had spoken to a former teacher on the Perisher course, and he'd said that one of the participants in the Perisher course, whilst he was about to launch his torpedo, the teacher tapped somebody else in the control room, I believe, or command room, I believe you call it, on the shoulder, and asked him to act irrationally. If my memory's correct, he specifically told him to pretend you've got a gun and start waving it around. And I've seen people behaving irrationally during COVID lockdown. So my question is, have you as teacher ever asked somebody to behave irrationally? And what advice would you give to people in a COVID situation, in lockdown, how to manage people who are behaving irrationally?
Yeah, so I did, and in a slightly different way. So because the thing about Perisher is it's a brilliant course, but I was always keen to learn from other organisations. So when I took over as teacher, or when I knew I was going to be teacher, I went off and did the Police Silver Commanders course. I went off and saw other businesses to find out how they lead. And when I was at the Police Silver Commanders course, they put me on the Negotiators course, which is just brilliant. So I used to take the Perisher students to the police college in Scotland and put them through a bit of that negotiation training, a minimum thing. And the reason being was eventually that was going to play out when they're at sea. So for me, the disruption was tomahawk strike. So you've got to have radio contact. One of the guys goes into the radio room and then locks himself in there because he wants to talk to his mum, and he just wants to talk to his mum. And you can't talk to his mum because obviously they're doing a tomahawk strike, but you can't launch the weapons because you've got to do this. So therefore, somebody's got to negotiate it. Do you use force? What are you going to do, Captain? How are you going to do this problem? So I think in the military, so the reality is you would use force to get that done, because selection and maintenance, the aim is to get the weapons away, and you wouldn't tolerate that. So that's what they ended up doing, which was the right thing to do. They couldn't negotiate out of it. But the thing in this world is, I think having the conversation to understand why people are feeling the way they are is not happening. That's what they need. People are angry. They're genuinely angry about a whole load of things, and it's not COVID. They're just angry about how they're being treated, how they're being communicated with, why they can't understand the decision making, everything else that goes on with it. It's just a struggle for them to understand it. And so, can everybody hear the cat, by the way?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's trying to negotiate with you.
I was thinking, can I hear something?
I thought it might be yours, Lorraine.
I was just
this is what you love during lockdown, isn't it?
Negotiate with it, but I couldn't. It's deadly force. So I think the problem is what we're seeing is people being angry about a whole load of things. I mean, I saw something today. I went to Sainsbury's to go buy some food. A bunch of kids went up to the bike, tried to bypass the queue. The woman said no. They then spat on the woman, and it's crazy behaviour. Called her a racist, and then luckily a police car happened to be there, and they got arrested. But the reality is, you would not see that behaviour. And what we're seeing is, because people are becoming more and more irrational, we need to find techniques to be able to bring them back into the room and control them and calm them down. But that is a skill set. So what we were asking people to do, we're asking everybody to go out and do that. But there's only a few of us that are capable of negotiating properly. And the unskilled negotiator can create a real problem.
Okay. There was a question, I think, from Raj, and then John, is that all right if we come back to you? Thank you. Raj, did you have a question?
Actually, it's if Ryan permits me, I can add a sentence to this. What I sort of realized over years is to prevent irrational behavior, it's better to be a realist rather than overtly optimistic or pessimistic. Especially when the going gets tough, you want a team which can actually rationally take a decision. It can't happen overnight. You need to have a team. You need to train the team realistically, and even optimism. Too much of optimism is dangerous on board. Actually, you need to be very realistic. So I think being a realist as a leader, I think passing that down, the realistic picture, if I may, I think probably could be the best way to prevent your team from running berserk.
Thank you for adding.
Yeah, I agree totally with you with that. I was never optimistic about what was coming up. I was always realistic, and I told them I'd always tell them the truth. So I would never hide anything from them. I would always tell them what was happening and why, because eventually they're going to find out, and at that point you lose your credibility if you haven't told them.
Yeah, that's a key word, isn't it? Honesty.
Yeah, and just to add to Paul's question about decision making, it's got a link to this. I've realized that the point where most of the decisions go bad or it is not accepted fully when the leader actually starts, going on his own trip. Actually, you leave your team behind. So that's the point where that divergence happens. And the moment that happens on board, the next thing is an accident coming your way because your team is not understanding what you're doing. So you may be taking a bad decision, but if you don't have your team with you, I'm not telling that Submarine is a democracy in its sense, but you need to make sure that your team understands why you're taking that decision. For that, you need to actually, be with them continuously and make sure that you don't sort of you don't get to a point where you're away from your team.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the why is a massive thing. I think when I've worked in organizations before, the amount of people in a team that don't even know why they're doing what they do, and they don't know the values, the purpose, etc. And so the strategy is very woolly. So yeah, I totally agree with the point around the why and being a true leader, being real. Thank you for those points, Raj. John, you had a question?
Yeah, if I could come back on the irrational behavior thing. I definitely don't have any of the experience that you guys have of these kind of things. But another flying story, I knew a guy who was in the airlines, and he's a very experienced captain. And they do a lot of recurrence training on simulators, and they do a similar kind of exercise where the instructor will whisper in the ear or by using the intercom to ask one of them to behave irrationally, or just do something wild. He could do anything. He could pretend he's had a heart attack, or he could do something and see how the other guy reacts. And this friend of mine was a captain in the simulator, and he decided not to do anything gross, but to do minor little things. Someone might have been under a bit of emotional pressure or physical pressure, you don't know. And so they were cleared down to 12,000 feet. He said, "Oh, I'm sure they cleared us down to 10." And, he's just getting numbers slightly wrong, doing slightly odd things. It took the other guy a long time to realize that there was something odd going on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. So any other questions? Just because I've not really talked to Facebook, we've got so engrossed into the room. So to anyone that is watching on Facebook, we're talking about submarine leadership here with Ryan Ramsey. So if you do have any questions, then pop them in the chat and we'll come back to them as soon as we can. So is there any other questions from you in the room? Some of you are listening very attentively, but any questions? Jason, I'm sure you've got a question that you want to fire at Ryan.
Second most used son.
Yeah, so I think it's very interesting listening to Ryan, and particularly his turbulent story. I'd be intrigued, and I'm not sure Ryan, where that happened in terms of your 3 years in command, where that incident occurred?
So that was in my last year.
Yeah.
May the 25th, 2011.
Because I think that it's interesting. You know, sometimes you can be really fortunate by having misfortunes, for want of a better phrase for that, to happen to you as a leader, because then that can give that whole signpost to your team that, exactly as you were just saying, Lorraine, about the honesty, the realism, and painting that picture, and finding yourself in a position then where, you know, it not that I'm sure, Ryan, that, you know, all your team wouldn't have thought you were amazing from day one, but if that happened right at the very beginning, and suddenly you then had 3 years with this bloke that had managed to get them from you know, a really awful scenario, that, well, they'd follow you anywhere. Not, of course, that they wouldn't have followed you in the first place, but I think that can be really key. So for, obviously, I know, Ryan, I'm a naval, or I was a naval aviator, and for 30 odd years, and a squadron boss. So I was very fortunate to have something go wrong literally in the first week, which was brilliant for me, because actually it made the whole team follow me, and then my 3 years were brilliant, were literally built on that day, which was fantastic. And likewise, I suppose, to bring it right up to the modern day, I've seen the panic and chaos of COVID, because having left the Navy last year, I stepped into the civvy world, and I got made redundant on COVID day one. So before they even introduced furlough. So it's been you know, an interesting time, and very interesting to see lots of people's reflections, particularly via the likes of LinkedIn on you know, leadership, etc. So it's really interesting to see you know, talking about those things of leadership a lot, Ryan. For the most part, probably us military people would think, you know, is relatively straightforward to us, but how amazing it is, and the lifting of the scales from line eyes, from, you know, people who run multinational companies, or goodness knows what else. It's you know, a fascinating ride the last 3 or 4 months have been.
I think the press, you know, are certainly talking about how people are being treated during the time, you know. So the businesses that will do well are the ones that are totally supportive of their teams, and, you know, using the right language, you know, is key for one, but actually the empowerment side as well. And you know, the check-in thing was an interesting conversation around, you know, people felt they were being checked up on rather than being checked in on, you know, and that's been quite a conversation in itself around, you know, the micromanage word. You know, they trusted them in the office, but then suddenly the distrust when they were working from home. So it's those kind of things, I think, where people have been called on, you know, and the press have sort of taken light to it, where people have felt they haven't had the right support, and they feel that suddenly the trust element has been taken away. So we might talk about that in a moment. But Paul, you had a question.
Yeah, it's really interesting hearing that, and actually, bizarrely, we've come very close to my question in the last moment or two. I was an airline finance director at the time of the Twin Towers attack, and our industry was rocked, I suppose is the best way to describe it, and we were very alone at the time, because it was us and not the whole, you know, economic and world community. You know, and the decision process was we had to change it markedly. We stepped up almost overnight and moved on. But I want to bring on something a little bit different. I've had a couple of conversations in the last week or two surrounding a perceived differentiation happening in some workplaces of the labour force. We're seeing, you know, people who used to work on a Friday at home and this sort of thing, and, you know, a small community who worked from home. We're seeing an increasing number of people whose businesses are going to go through a change. Now, partly through separation. They don't have the accommodation to house people, but they're seeing almost a two-part community within their businesses. So we're having those who are, I'm going to use, what I'm about to say sounds awful, but the factory worker who works in the factory, who cannot take their work home, and those who can take their work home. And they're seeing a sort of a, well, it's okay for them, but not okay for that group. And, you know, they're trying very hard, they're finding it very hard to deal with this conversation of, you know, in the office, they can take a laptop home. Well, you have a job that you have to be at site in your factory or in your office, your lab, or wherever it is every day. This is quite a different dynamic because, you know, we've had, you know, Brian and Mary and a few others go home on a Friday afternoon because they work away and they do that, or they're a salesman, they work from home, they come into the office. But I'm starting to see groups of people, you know, 5, 10, 15, 20% of, you know, a manufacturing or engineering type business who, well, they now go to work at home, and they probably will work at home long term and forever. And people, I think, have really seen with the furloughing, you know, I don't enjoy commuting for an hour and a half, 2 hours every day. You know, great, you know, I'm not sure what everyone's wearing below the screen, but I'm in shorts and I'm barefoot, you know, because it's very hot today. You know, if I was in the office environment, I'd be in trousers. You know, in the old days, it was a shirt and a tie and a suit. You know, more latter years, sort of chinos, shoes, socks, shirt. You know, we're seeing, we could see a sort of two-class business community coming up, and I'd be really interesting. Maybe once from the military view, coming from a more military style, where they would see how do we deal with this, because this is going to cause quite a differentiation in the workforce.
Great question.
That really is. So the military obviously have you could turn on a class system and go, there's officers and there's ratings or non-commissioned officers, or and that's the system itself. And even within the officer, you could turn around and go, the differential between a lieutenant and an admiral is massive, and is there a cadet that goes with it? I don't know. So my view is, I think I think you're right. There is a bit of that. Without I'm seeing that with some of the clients we're working with, that exactly that is happening. But that then comes down to how, and this sounds probably a little bit nebulous, but how leadership deals with that. So we've been saying to organizations is, maybe you don't want to bring people back, and maybe some people don't want to come back, but you have to have that discussion with everyone and actually find the workforce. There are workforces out there that are just glad that they're actually at a factory and not bringing their work back home, because the flip side of what you've described there is suddenly your home is no longer your home, it's your office, and you're no longer working to live or living to work. You're just working continuously, and you're not knocking off when you're doing it. And there's instant communications. If somebody says they want a meeting, immediately they're definitely on there. People who've liked working as a team have found it really difficult, and some of their individual capabilities have been found wanting, and that's been a real psychological struggle. And then they've got nowhere to go and ask for help with this stuff. And I think it's exposed all of these things within the team dynamic, and leadership has to determine what the company looks like going forward and explain that to everybody and where they fit into that. And there's, I do believe there's consultation. I mean, if you're saying, say for example, the factory worker doesn't want to go to work in the factory, then how, you know, that's how the company's going to look going forward. You can't do anything about it. But what support can we give you to make you comfortable with with that differentiation? So yeah, it is really, really difficult, I think. But I think I honestly think in general, when we come out of this, it won't ever go back to how it was, but it will be a new norm, and we will just have to try and get used to that norm, and leadership has to support everybody through that.
Yeah.
It's quite interesting. You know, you've picked up pretty much what I said. What I've been saying to people for the last couple of weeks is there is a mix and match. I mean, I think I used the word like a mix and match now in your business, and there will be some people who will find it very difficult. You know, there are people in one of the business I'm sort of doing some work with who do not like working at home. Some of them don't have the space to work at home, whatever their situation is, and it's not because the whole family's at home. You know, they got a very small flat or whatever it is. There are some, like I spent a year some years ago. I worked from home. I absolutely hated it. Hated it with a vengeance. About every 3 or 4 weeks, once every 3 or 4 weeks, I had Liberation Day where I went to meet some other colleagues, and it was great. Now I'm much more relaxed about it. But one of the things I've said to them is, okay, in this period of adjustment, and I use the word very carefully, of adjustment, you know, it's a bit like keeping people in contact, bringing the people into the office, you know, maybe 1 or 2 days a week, and sort of very careful with the hot desking, because that's a really hot topic at the minute. So you don't have keyboards and screens. You come in with a laptop and it's all cleaned every night, sort of thing. But you know, one of the companies are trying this now, of just bringing the teams in, blending them, the ones that are more at home. They've got some who need to work from home because of shielding. That seems to be working. They're finding a way, but they do see that in a year or two, they will probably have quite different people working in different roles in their businesses.
Yeah,
and it is everyone is very different in this situation. John.
Well, that last thing was what I did say to them all, is be clear in the communication of what you're doing and why you're doing it.
Yeah.
I'll go
Me
quiet.
again. I've got to go at 5 o'clock actually, because I've got an online thing to run. But I was going to say this talk. My focus is on organisational innovation, and it's interesting to talk about whether there'll be the new normal is an interesting term, but whether we'll revert back. My view is that there'll be 3 categories of behaviours. There'll be those where we automatically revert back to what we were doing before, because it made sense, because the conditions are back to pretty much what they were before. There'll be those behaviours where we've changed and we stick with what we've changed to, because it makes more sense. It might have made more sense before, but it certainly makes sense now. But the really interesting category are the ones in between, where we probably revert back, but the experience of having done it a different way has given us some look ahead and some experience, which might enable us to adopt this new approach more readily than we would have done before. And I think that's the interesting category.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
Perfect, thank you. Any other questions from you guys in the room? Facebook, there's no questions on there at the moment. Any of you that are not on video, Linus, I see you've joined us. Any of you that have questions, just you can raise your hand by using the participant and raise your hand logo. Sometimes it's a bit difficult on a phone, but just so you've got that. There's a couple of people. Yeah, I'm not sure what's happening with it. I have to keep muting one individual, but I don't know if they want to ask a question. So I've popped them a question in the chat. So we're going back to kind of irrational behaviour. So something I've been studying quite a lot on psychology and the understanding of behaviours, and pretty much our unconscious pretty much drives 90 to 95% of our behaviour. So how we were either before lockdown or during lockdown, etc., obviously then becomes part of us. Now, as a leader, if this situation has had quite a big impact, so I'm kind of taking this from an impact of you when you were on the submarine and certain people were impacted on it, if they've experienced some quite deep trauma or it's affected them quite badly, how would that be dealt with from a support perspective, or what is out there for those people? Because I know it's going to be a big thing where there'll be people that don't do anything about it, and I think it's something that needs to be more a raised awareness that we're human, and it's a difficult time.
That's a really good question. So after that event, luckily we used to go off and train everything. So we had what's called a trauma management team on board, TRIM team, and they were really good, because directly after the incident they set up the TRIM team and they did all the talking and everything else, and that really helped people. And if you'd have gone back 10 years, 15 years, people would go, you're a man, just get on with it and take it. But they actually talked, and everybody was completely open. And what was interesting was the range of emotions, from guilt to shame to, you know, particularly for those people that had collapsed because of the heat exhaustion, they let the teammates down, all that, the fear, everything else that went with it. The only person who didn't do that was me. And I don't mind sharing that I got that totally wrong. And so I turned around and said, I'm all right, you know, I'll get on and come on with it. In fact, we were on a patrol. We were just going on a patrol then, so I had to leave through the patrol and everything else. And I always wondered how, and I got asked this question a lot. So when I joined the Wins Leadership Program, and I decided to go around and share that day with people, the good and the bad and everything else that went with it. What I didn't share was that I was really scared. I was really scared from the moment that it happened. I didn't share that I didn't think we were going to make it. At the very beginning, I thought, I don't understand how we're going to recover from this, and this could be the last time. And that was a really significant emotion. And I hadn't taken any counselling for it, and it was only last year I did it. And I have to say, it's the best thing I did, because it unpacked every single, relived the event, which was really difficult to do, because in the fog of war, in that amount of stress, piecing it all together is virtually impossible. I mean, I wrote it all down in my book, and even when I read it in my book, I still think that I've missed bits out of it, or did it really happen like that? So so that unpacked it, and it enabled me to get around the emotional journey. I think so. If we wind that forward to now, there's a load of employee helplines and everything else. The standard of those ranges from good to poor. Looking for the visible elements of stress, the changes in behaviour of people, and providing them the opportunity to go get the right counselling and to talk it through, because all of us have been put in a position. Generally, some of us have had training, but not for this. But the vast majority of this population, I mean, hats off to them for having jumped into the worst situation ever, and still living and functioning and gradually getting used to it. I mean, that's incredible, with no training whatsoever and very little support, to be fair. So, but people need to talk about it, but you need to talk to the right person. That's what I found. So I thought by talking to businesses and sharing that story about leadership and teamwork on a day, I was actually counselling myself. And the reality was, it wasn't until last year that somebody professional unpicked it all. And honestly, I sleep better at night. I've stopped worrying about it. It's happened. I talk to my team still very regularly, and I share with them the emotional journey that I went through on that day, because I think it's far enough in the past that I can share that. So it shows fallibility as well, doesn't it? So the reality was, in their eyes, I was this calm, level-headed. He got us through it. He did that, and actually inside, I was a wreck trying to work out how the heck we're going to survive, and really quite scared. And I didn't realise that until last year.
And it is something that I think, you know, from a leadership perspective, that we need to be really recognising some of those signs in our teams as they start to return back to work. You know, as a leader, having those critical conversations, humble conversations, to make sure that people feel comfortable to come forward if they are having any emotional or, you know, their well-being is being impacted. You know, it's a hot topic. Well-being is massive, and this is mentally, emotionally, physically, spiritually. You know, people are being shaken, and unfortunately, there are people that just never reach out. They never speak up. They hold it all in. They put the mask on, you know, and, you know, like you just said, everyone saw this facade, but actually inside there was something very different going on. And I think it's, as leaders, I think there needs to be a massive focus on that mental well-being as people start to return into work, more than anything. You know, of course, businesses are all about profit, but there'll be no profit if their team aren't there to do the work.
Yeah, so I'd agree with that. I'd just echo, counter with one thing. I've seen the other side, the other end of that, where leaders come into work and they're all emotionally all over the place, and that is not a good place to be either. You know, how you feel and say, oh, it's really awful, I'm having an awful day and I'm doing this. That is not what I want from a leader, and I don't think that's what other people want from a leader. They want to be led, and they want consistency, which goes back to that piece. Don't be too happy, don't be too sad. but do it. But you need to talk to someone. So I think the more senior that you get, the less you can have those conversations about, you know, I'm feeling really bad today. But you've got to find somebody you can talk to. And I've got a mentor, a business mentor actually, and I will talk to him. So if I'm really quite stressed out about numbers or whatever, P&L generally, but if I'm stressing out about that because that's all new stuff to me, I know I've got somebody I can talk to about it. But my leadership is consistent throughout. So, and I think that's really that's going to be really important when we pull out of this, that leadership stays consistent. But we need to look after those leaders. So it's finding the right person to have that conversation with.
Yeah, perfect. So one more question. I was going to say we've got time for one more question. So Paul, you got in there.
Just a quick one on leadership style. A lot of us sort of business leaders have got to change our business models and the way we do things post-COVID. Do you think as business leaders we should really seriously consider our leadership style and adapting that?
Yeah, so my view, it's a generalisation, so I apologise for that. But coming from the military into the business world, I see a lot of passive aggressive behaviour. It's like they've got something to say, but they're not going to quite say it, and they're going to make you feel really bad about it. I saw that on a couple of boards that I've sat on, and I really don't like it. So, because I sit there going, if you've got a problem, just please tell me what the problem is, and we'll work it out together. But don't just sit silently, because that doesn't work for me. So I would see this almost as an opportunity to improve, and we always want to continuously improve, don't we? So all the good stuff we've learned out of this COVID crisis, and there is some really good stuff that we've learned out of this. The way we communicate has changed a little. The questions we're asking pointed. The use of technology. I mean, if I look at my organisation, the way we've transitioned to using new technology and everything else is just incredible. And I'm really proud of what the team have done to do that. But I think you can change. This is the ideal time to make those changes. It really is the ideal time to make those changes, to turn around and use this as the catalyst for making leadership better if it needs it.
Yeah, totally agree. Thank you.
I think sort of back to leadership styles as well. I think one of the best ways in looking at it is from how much support do I need to provide and how much challenge do I need to give, and then work out what leadership style you need to go in with, because you know what you don't want to do is patronize people, but the other thing, you don't want to stress people. So, you know, I tend to use that model quite a lot when I'm doing leadership. You know, where are your team at? You know, how much support do they need? You know, do you need to hold their hand, or do you actually let them have free rein? How much challenge do I give them if they're feeling a bit incompetent and not confident? Giving them high challenge and no support is probably not the best way forward. Kind of incorporate that as well as you know, what we've just talked about. So quite conscious of time. I think I want to just say thank you so much, Ryan, for your time today. It's been really great to hear from sort of your experience and your background, because I think, you know, there's no better person that's actually been in a massive isolation system, or submarine, I should call it, not a system. And so that wealth of knowledge is you know, is more important now than ever. And you know, I was fortunate to meet Ryan a fair few years ago on a submarine leadership day, which was absolutely inspiring, and the guys got so much from it, so hence why I've brought him onto the show. So thank you so much for your time. If you are interested in more about what Ryan does and how he can help, then I will put those links onto the video that will come out. Project 7 Consultancy.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, but hey, can I just say thanks, because I got loads out of that. That's fantastic. I like talking to other leaders and hearing what they have to say and taking back. So thanks very much for questions, comments, and everything. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, and thank you for everyone for being here today and asking some really great questions, because without the questions, it's yeah, it's not a show, is it? So thank you much for your time, and keep an eye out. I'll post the video onto Facebook and onto LinkedIn, and if you wish, I can send it out on email as well. So cool. Thank you.
Cheers,
Thank you,
Jason.